Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. We pray our blessings upon you tonight. We've just prayed before we've come online to Facebook. We're sitting here in a space where we have cameras, phones and computers. We have people from our church connected via Zoom with us tonight, and of course we're blessed by those of you who are joining us on Facebook. So thanks for that. I just pray that tonight's message blesses you. We're continuing on with our series called A Journey to Faith, and tonight's lesson is called The Israelites Inherit the Promised Land. We're moving on from after they entered the land of Canaan, and they went and fought some battles around Gibeon against the Amorite kings on the southern part of what becomes the future kingdom of Judah in the hill country. And then now they're about to head up into the northern part of Israel, and they're going to conquer the cities there. And of course we learn about what happens in terms of their inheritance, because all of the people are about to receive their inheritance, which is the fulfillment of Abraham's covenant. And tonight we finish off with basically with the end of the life of Joshua the leader, and also the high priest as well. They both come to the end of their journeys. The high priest is Aaron's son Eleazar, and so this portion comes up to this stage. Next week we will move on to the stage where they actually fight a few more battles. They finally overcome Jerusalem, which they haven't overtaken at this point in time, that the Jebusites occupy, and we find that Salmon, the current descendant in the genealogy of Jesus that we're following from Matthew chapter 1 verse 5, he is the first of the family from the descendants of Abraham, who will inherit the land of Bethlehem. And of course this is where Jesus is to be born in the future. So just a little bit of background to bring you up to speed with where we're starting from tonight. So in the lesson itself, we were up to chapter 10 in the book of Joshua, so we're reading and learning predominantly from the book of Joshua at this point in time. And we had this point in time where once they had these battles down at Gibeon and overcome the 5 Amorite kings and many of the cities, that they returned to Gilgal, which is just north of Jericho, and this was the place where they had encamped since they crossed the Jordan River. So the Israelites had been on the road, and they'd been travelling for a period of time now, fighting, and so as I said, they've just returned back, but they didn't get much of an opportunity to sit and relax, for the kings in the north had heard of the Israelites' success and the mighty power of their God. So reading now from Joshua chapter 11 verses 1 to 5, it reads, "When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of this, he sent word to Jobab, king of Madon, to the kings of Ahimron and Akshaph, and to the northern kings who were in the mountains, in the Arba south of Kinnereth, which is the Sea of Galilee, so that's still in the north, in the western foothills, and in a place called Naphoth Dor, which is the heights of Dor." So that's actually the Mount Carmel of today. So again, it's up in the north against the Mediterranean, between there and the Sea of Galilee. And then on to the Canaanites in the east and the west, to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites and Jebusites in the hill country, and to the Hivites below Hermon in the region of Mizpah. So Mount Hermon's at the extreme northern boundary where the tribe of Dan will occupy, and it's where the mountain melts its snow to this present day, and the water flows through the Hula Valley down into the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and down into the Dead Sea. Now it says, "They came out with all their troops and a large number of horses and chariots, a huge army," the Bible tells us, "as numerous as the sand on the seashore. All these kings joined forces and made camp together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel." So we learn that the Israelites are a real threat. that all of the kings have joined together in the north to come against them. You may remember, if you've watched the series, that I mentioned that the Israelites, when they entered across the Jordan River opposite Jericho, they basically cut the land of Canaan into two, into the north and to the south. And so when they entered and overcome the original cities of Jericho, Ai and Bethel, they then went to the south and they've conquered the hill country of the south, and now they're facing battles to the north. So they've actually separated their battles, if you will. So you can imagine if they didn't do this, they would have had all the armies coming against them at the same time. And remember, the Bible makes it clear that these people are giant people, like that of Goliath. And they're descendants of the giants from the time of Noah. And so they were facing these giant races with giant kings, and they'd all come together. So you could see the fear that these kings had. The news was finally travelling through the land that they're here. And so they're coming together to stop the Israelites from taking over the northern part of the land of Canaan. So Salmon, the person that we're following, and the rest of them, they had hardly had time to settle in the camp, and they were basically called back to serve the army of Israel again. They were told that there was this enormous army from a coalition of kingdoms to their north, and the numbers were so vast that they were described as numerous as the sand on the seashore, which the scripture just said. And this time they were accompanied by a large number of horses and chariots. So for the first time, the Israelites are going to encounter these kings that aren't just having their soldiers on foot, but they've actually got chariots and horses. So it's going to be a lot more difficult this time. So they set off northwards along the highway through the hill country, and they would have passed through Shechem, the highway known as the Way to Shur, descended out of the hills before a place called Bet Shean, which is the house of rest we've mentioned in the past. Bet Shean is located at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, next to the Jordan River, and this is the crossing point between the land of Mesopotamia and the land of Canaan. But they followed the Jordan River north until they passed around the Sea of Kiryat, again that's the Sea of Galilee as we know it today, and they headed towards this place called the Waters of Merom. So I'm just going to pop a map up. So you can see at the top of Israel there's those lines there with the red where they're going to the north, and those with the green where they head across to the coast. So they're the pathways that they were actually taking to conquer these new cities. So we find them down here at Gilgal above the top of the Dead Sea. Jerusalem's just here, and they travel all the way up the north around the Sea of Kiryat, the Sea of Galilee, and up into this northern region which I've just listed in the scripture there. So the Waters of Merom is a place which is a significant battlefield, and it's normally placed at a lake called Hula, north of the Sea of Galilee. It's also fed by the Jordan River, and you know this significant place has historical references to it as well, that it's located in the upper Galilee. So as they approached the enemy, the Israelites army paused and they camped for the night. Before they had left earlier that day, the Lord had said to Joshua in chapter 11 verse 6, "Do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them over to Israel slain. You are to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots." So we find out here that the Lord's hand is on the situation as usual. So Joshua called for a small group of volunteers to go ahead in the night, and he explained to them how the Lord had told him that they had a large number of horses and chariots, and that he needed them to hamstring the horses and burn their chariots. So this is a particularly unpleasant thing. I may ask the question, does anyone know what hamstringing a horse entails? Any thoughts?
Cutting its lower tendons.
Right. Yeah, that's right, Tim. So basically they take a knife, so they creep up behind the horses, and they'll actually cut with a knife their lower tendons above the actual hoof, which will render it impossible for the horse to either stand up or to actually run away. So today we would obviously deem that a very cruel thing to do, at this point in time they're going into war, and these animals are being used to fight against them. So I guess they thought that it was a reasonable thing to do. So this group, because I've been writing about Salmon, I've included him in the story just to paint the picture of what it would have been like to go up there. So they all trusted the Lord, because obviously the Lord had told them to do this, and they were going up to this massed enemy, and so you can imagine there would be reasonable doubt or fear that they would have. But what they actually did was they trusted in the Lord and they obeyed their leader. And so the next day after they returned back, Joshua then led the whole army up to the waters of Merom, the Bible tells us, against the armies of the northern kings, and attacked them. So of course they've no longer got their asset, their chariots and their horses, so it equalises them where they're all on foot for this battle. The Bible says in Joshua chapter 11 verse 8, they defeated them and pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon, to Mizrepoth Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah on the east, until no survivors were left. So these are places. The Mizrepoth is actually on the coast. Greater Sidon is on the coast of the Mediterranean, and the other location, the valley of Mizpah on the east, was actually above the Sea of Galilee. The Bible tells us there was no survivors left, so they would have turned back, and the first city that they would have captured would have been a city called Hazor. So I'm going to put that one up for you to have a look at. This picture, which has just been held up in the camera for Facebook, but basically it shows a huge tell. So it's a raised city, and you can see the number of buildings that are on there and the construction of the gates at the entry. You can see the chariots on the road going up. I hope you can see that okay. But this particular picture is actually a picture of a plaque that we took when we were actually there in Israel, and this was from the ruins there. They've actually recreated the city, and this is what it would have looked like. Now Tel Hazor is actually the biggest city that was actually in the land of Canaan. So it was a very large city, and so this was thought to have a population of roughly 15,000 people. So we talked about Jericho would have had no more than 3,000 odd people, and we find this has got 15,000, so it's approximately 5 times the size of the ancient city of Jericho. The Bible actually says in Joshua 11 chapter 10, it calls it the head of all those kingdoms. So it's saying it's the greatest city of them all in the northern part of the land of Canaan. And so we get this this picture, and again from the archaeological ruins it's very easy to see the actual scale of this city. So going back to the story, Joshua turned back and captured Hazor, as I said, for it was the head of all northern kings. So it was critical to wipe out the most powerful of the cities. He put all of its inhabitants to the sword, including its king, whom was known as Jabin. They killed all their livestock, destroyed the city, and set it on fire. All of the other northern cities were destroyed. Their people and their kings were all put to the sword. Their livestock, however, was spared, and Salmon received his share with the plunder. The Israelites destroyed the cities and exterminated their inhabitants as the Lord had commanded. So I've got a couple of other pictures. So these next pictures actually show the ruins there at Tel Hazor today. So on these ruins here, this is at Tel Hazor today. So Tel Hazor, we're in the actual Canaanite Palace. So the top picture that's on there shows 2 massive big pillars which held up the roof structure, which are still there today, and that's been photographed from inside, looking out to the front, and there's some stone ruins on the front there, and those stone ruins actually represent an altar which was there. So they would come out of the palace and make their sacrifices on their altar directly in front of the palace. So these will get posted onto YouTube. The bottom picture is actually inside, and you can see that there's two layers. There's this black basalt, which is a volcanic rock which is everywhere in the northern part of Israel, and above it they have these mud clay bricks. So these mud bricks that are actually there are exactly the same as the ones in the Bible, where they used to produce them in Egypt, where they talk about them mixing the hay with the mud to form the actual bricks. So when you go close to them, you can still see to this day bricks that are 4,000 odd years old. You can still see today the straw that's in them in this amazing condition. So it's quite fascinating. Obviously we share these pictures because they bring truth to the Bible, because you can go to the land of Israel today, you can see these places are real, you can see the evidence of the battle, you can see where they've been burnt, and you can see what's left of the ruins. So we always like to share them for that reason. Still here on Tel Hazor, walking up onto the upper part of the Tel. So that section I was photographing earlier was the lower part, so there was a lower city, and then later on an upper city that was built. This upper city was built with the Israelites, and this place that we're actually looking at here, this is built by King Salman. So these gates, so this style of gates, which are built on many fortresses and the Temple of Jerusalem, etc., the styling all comes from King Solomon. So just walking out to the sign here, when we have a look at this, you can see a picture of what it used to look like. There's that gate, the two turrets in the inside gate, so there's like a two-sided gate, so if there's any problem there was the means to close it off. There's been quite a lot of artifacts discovered here, and the gates that are here are similar to the ones that we saw at Megiddo. As the sign here is saying, the connection between Hazor, Megiddo and Gezer is reflected in the following verse that describes Solomon's building activities. In 1 Kings 9:15 it says, "This was the purpose of the forced labour which Solomon imposed. It was to build the house of the Lord, his own palace, the Millo and the wall of Jerusalem, and to fortify Hazor, Megiddo and Gezer." Now the word the Millo, that refers to the fortress. So that's in Jerusalem. The Millo is the fortress that they built next to the Temple of Jerusalem to house the garrison of soldiers to protect Jerusalem, and no doubt to protect the very Temple of Jerusalem itself. So here we are walking through King Solomon's ancient gate, up through the path and into the inside here of the ancient fortress. Let's walk up here. They've, like in some of the other ones, they've constructed a few passageways to protect the ruins so people don't walk on them. As we walk along to the side, you can see the layers and the ancient steps. All of this rooms that would have been different dwellings. Up there in the background, where there's trees in the background, there's another set of ruins. So this sort of tell goes for a fair old way. So I'll just walk up here, and we're going to go to this protected section. And here on the left you can see these large perfectly dressed blocks that were used in the construction. In this site here they've found some artifacts. This was down the bottom you can see the difference in the stone size and the construction method. It's a lot coarser, and this was an old Canaanite temple. So again, like all these tells, have layers of history. The Canaanites were here first, so we're probably looking at some of the construction here that was done, all that rubble behind. And all this was done during the time of King Jabin, or Jabin if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. So it's quite incredible. As we come up here, we can see that there's clay bricks here, So these clay bricks show the age of the construction, the sophistication of the construction, because this is the Canaanite method. And then walking up here, we enter up onto this platform on the right where the roof is. There's obviously been some work to protect this. So just going to walk up this entrance here. So they've done some work here to protect the original walls, as you can see, fairly substantial retaining work. Obviously it takes away the authenticity, but at the same time protects the original work. So here's these walls, still in a great state of decay. And on the other side, and as we walk in here, just fell over a step. Looking through the viewfinder rather than where my feet are. You can see all these ancient walls here. You can see the big blocks on the footings from the basalt stone in the region, and then on top of that they're using all these clay bricks for building the actual houses, etc. So we're literally walking around inside, so through a corridor here and into this rooms. You can see there in the various rooms. Back around again. I'm going up close, you can maybe see that, but there's actually bits of straw here. The fibres of straw still there today. So it's just clay that's full of straw. You can see all the fibres there. So these are the same building method that you read in the Bible that the Egyptians forced the Israelites to make. You see the old cracked and the straw that binds it all together. Quite amazing just to be able to see that close up. Okay, so during this time, the Bible tells us that Joshua destroyed the giant race of Anakites from all of the hill country. So in Joshua chapter 11, verse 22 reads, "No Anakites were left in Israelite territory, only in Gaza, Gath and Ashdod did any survive." So if I ask that question, might be another tricky question, but who were the Anakites? Who were they descended from? Does anyone know? Any takers on that one? No? So the Anakites were actually descendants of their leader. Every name that's in the Bible ends in "ite" comes from the name of the first person. So the Israelites came from Israel, right? The Canaanites came from the land of Canaan. So the Anakites came from a person called Anak, who in the Bible was actually a king. And he is actually a descendant of the Nephilim. So they're the giant sons of God that the Bible talks about, the fallen angels, who came down and married the beautiful women at the time of Noah and had children. So all of these races of people that are throughout the land of Israel are actually all descendants from that time. So we find at this point in time, of all the battles that they've already had, that they've actually destroyed all of these peoples, excepting for those left in Gaza, Gath and Ashdod. So when we get later in the Bible to the time of Goliath and the story of Samson, we get around the area of Gath, and this is where the giant Goliath came from. And so the Bible here in the time of Joshua, long before this, is telling us that this is one of the three places of the remnants of the giant races. Okay, so moving on, so during the period of conquering and subduing the land of Canaan, there's no time frame or dates that provide us with a specific understanding of how long these campaigns actually took. We can, however, calculate this from comments from the leader of the tribe of Judah, Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. Because he says to Joshua when they return and settle back into their encampment at Gilgal, he says that he was 40 years old when Moses sent him from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land of Canaan. And you'll find that in Joshua chapter 14, verses 6 to 7. So he specifically says he was 40 years old when Moses sent him from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land of Canaan. So this was 2 years after the Israelites left Egypt. Knowing that the Israelites wandered in the desert for another 38 years until they came into the land of Canaan, Caleb says 45 years have passed and he is now 85 years old. So that's found in Joshua chapter 14 verse 10. So we can determine from this that Caleb and the Israelites were in the land of Canaan at Gilgal near Jericho now for 7 years. So the Bible is a very interesting document, but it does depend on how you actually read it. You can actually be quite clinical like I have here, and by evaluating all the scriptures you can actually put dates together and work out how long things actually took. So we find at this point in time, since they've been in the land of Canaan, that they've taken those first cities, they've gone down south, they've gone up to the north, and 7 years have actually passed since they've actually been there. So in Joshua 14:14 it then says the land had rest from war. So we find out at this point in time that war had actually stopped. In other words, nobody wanted to come against them again, because every battle that they fought they actually won because the Lord was with them. So it was at this time that the Lord told Joshua to divide the land of Canaan between the Jordan River and the Great Sea, and you'll read that in Joshua 15 verse 12. Now the Great Sea of course is the Mediterranean Sea as we know it today, and he's saying to divide it among the 9 tribes and the other half of the tribe of Manasseh. So you may remember when they first went to enter the land of Canaan, they first had to overcome the kings, King Sihon and King Og, on the other side of the Jordan River, and so those territories were actually given to 2.5 of the tribes. So basically now, because they've entered the land, they've conquered most of the enemies who want to fight them, the Lord's actually saying now's the time to start dividing up the land between the tribes. So we start to find now that the fulfillment of the covenant of the inheritance of land is about to take place at this stage in the Bible. This actually shows you the original designated territories of the original Canaanites tribes that were throughout the land. And we see the list of Hivites, Hittites, Girgashites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Anakites, and of course the Avites, and the only one who aren't an Ite is the Philistines. So they all occupied the land. Could you get the next picture please and hold that one up? And then the next picture, which we've got on the right on Zoom here, that's been held up for the camera for Facebook right now, that particular picture there, it actually shows you the land that's now actually being conquered. So in the peach colour there's a green and a peach colour. The peach colour shows you the land that's been conquered and is under Israelite control, and the green areas there show you the land at this point in time that hasn't been conquered. So you find that the green land, if you look at it by proportion, they've roughly conquered about half of the land at this point in time, whereas the Israelites have actually taken half, and half is left over. So that shows you there. You can see Jerusalem was on that map. It's knocked in as a separate area which hasn't been conquered as well. So you can sort of see the progress of the Israelite people. But at this point, as I said, half of the land only is conquered, but God says to start splitting up the inheritance. So you can imagine what this looks like. So if I'm one of the people in the tribes who are going to inherit land that still actually hasn't been conquered, then that's going to be a bit of a problem. Half of the land actually hasn't been conquered, and yet God's saying, let's split that land up. So what that means is that when they actually give the land for their inheritance, some of them are going to have to go and fight for their land after they actually split up. And so this is where the Bible heads next and explains how that actually looks. So the scripture that I started reading from Joshua 13 verses 2 to 5 lists all of these territories that are counted as Canaanite, the land of Canaanite. As I said, the territory of the 5 Philistine rulers was Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath and Ekron. And so we find that these places, which are going to be right along the coast. So if you actually look at the map, and again we'll post them onto YouTube, the coastal area is actually not touched. They don't conquer any of the coast against the Mediterranean whatsoever. And then the very bottom of the land, which is all desert, they haven't bothered going down there yet, which is probably not too significant because not many people are living in that area. And then we've got a pocket there up on the north on the other side of the Jordan River. So we look at that and we think, well, why haven't they actually conquered those areas? And the reason is, and we explained this earlier, is that the Egyptians were still in control of the coastal route and across the Jezreel Valley to Beit Shean, and then they used to jump across the other side and they were up into northern Mesopotamia. So we find that the areas that they fought was the hill country. The hill country contains all of the natural water springs, it contains all of the fortified cities, and it contains all of the land which is going to provide their needs, whereas the land that doesn't provide the needs and that is held by the Egyptians, they actually stay away from at this point in time. It's necessary to understand that the area that the Philistines occupied, the Philistines were actually placed there in history by the Egyptians, and we will come and explain how this actually happened a bit later. But there was a sea battle, and it was the first sea battle that the Egyptians ever won, because they weren't originally a seafaring nation, and they took all of these people believed to be from the Isle of Cyprus or Crete, and they actually placed them into these cities, and they basically used them to manage these fortified cities. And they had fortresses there with their soldiers, but they made them work there, and this is where the origins of the actual Philistines came from. So today we have the situation in Israel where we have all these land claims from the Palestinians versus the Israelites, and people get very upset about all of this. The reality is that the Palestinians of today are not the Philistines of the past, as the claim lays. It was the British who actually named the land Palestine much later on, and there's other times in history where it was called Palestinia. And so we find that these things happen much later on. So I'm just mentioning that because the Philistines that were there, they originally came out of the Mediterranean islands from the Crete or Greek areas. They were placed there by the Egyptians, but we find out in the Bible later on that they of course are wiped out. And so the modern day claim that the land is connected to the Philistines, and of course Gaza is one of those areas, as we know. The Gaza Strip, as it's known, full of the Palestinians. It is not connected to biblical history whatsoever. Okay, so I'll just return back to the back to where we're at with the scripture. Okay, so the Lord went on to say in Joshua chapter 13, verses 6 to 7, "As for all the inhabitants of the mountainous regions from Lebanon to Mizrathoth-Maim, that is all the Sidonians, I myself will drive them out before the Israelites. Be sure to allocate this land to Israel for an inheritance, as I have instructed you, and divide it as an inheritance among the 9 tribes and half of the tribe of Manasseh." So the Lord's telling them there that he knows that this land's not conquered, but he will actually drive them out before them as they go to enter and receive their inheritance. So we've got to understand here that God is a covenant-filling God. He's promised them this land, and so he's telling them that he will go before them and clear the path in order to make sure that they receive the land that they've actually been promised. So there's not many other people who could conquer half of the land and promise that the people would receive their inheritance. And yet because God's actually speaking to Joshua, who's then speaking to his people, we're finding out that he's saying he will always be with them, he will always go before them, and they will always be successful in battle, but there is some rules. And the but rules is that they have to be obedient to God. And so we find now, as we've passed through this next phase of the Bible, we're about to enter into the time of the judges before the kings, that his people start to be infected by those people that they don't conquer, and as a consequence there's areas of land that they actually don't manage to conquer. At this point in time, God's saying, be obedient to me, and that obedience is what? So I'm going to ask that question. What did God ask his people to do when they went into the land of Canaan? Any takers? What was one of the warnings that he gave, and what was one of the promises that he gave to his people before they went in? No takers? Okay, so the first thing was that they weren't to intermarry or to mingle with the people, because he knew that they would be infected by their beliefs and their false gods. The other side of it was he told them that they were to kill all people, women, children, men, everybody, not to leave any of them alive, because he knew that if they did, that there would be consequences for his own people. And so this promise that he's now making in Joshua chapter 13 is actually on the basis that they kill all people. Up to now, the Bible tells us very clearly that they killed all people. Right? Apart from the Gibeonites, because of the vow that was made, everybody else has actually been killed. Okay, so given that the land to the east of the Jordan River had already been allotted by Moses to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh, the Bible tells us in Joshua 14 verse 1, now these are the areas the Israelites received as an inheritance in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest, Joshua the son of Nun, and the heads of the tribal clans of Israel allotted them. So when it came to dividing the land to the west of the Jordan River, as always, it was the tribe of Judah who would come first. So to the west of the Jordan River, if you've got your orientation switched on, is actually from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. It's the land of Israel today. To the east of the Jordan River is Jordan today. So we're finding out here that the land to the west, that the first tribe will be the tribe of Judah. So this was always the case as the fulfillment of the prophecy's sake. Okay, so the leader of the tribe of Judah, of course, was Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite. So he's one of the two people who actually survived generationally and went from the land of Israel, and he's actually going to make it into the land of Canaan, and he's going to receive his inheritance. The other one, of course, was Joshua himself. So Caleb the son of Jephunneh led his men to meet with Eleazar the high priest, Joshua the son of Nun, and the other heads of the tribal clans, which is what they were all called to do. He laid the first claim to any land. He recounted how he had wholeheartedly followed the Lord when he went up to survey the land of Canaan with Joshua and the other leaders from every tribe of Israel. So to inherit their land, they're going to stand up and say, I did this and I did that, so therefore I should be entitled to something worthy. And so this is what's happening here. So Moses had promised to him in Joshua 14 verse 9, the land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance, and that of your children forever. So Joshua blessed Caleb and gave him Hebron, which in those days was called Kiryat Arba, in the hill country in the south. So Hebron today is south of Jerusalem and south of Bethlehem, and it's about 25 kilometres, I believe, about south of Jerusalem, which lines up roughly with the top of the Dead Sea. So then came the allotment for the tribe of Judah, clan by clan. I'm not going to go through this for every tribe, but we are going through the relevant bits for the tribe of Judah, for Salmon and for the other people, because they're the people that we're actually following through the genealogy of Jesus. So the boundaries for the land allotted to the tribe of Judah was first described to its people. They received the largest portion of land, for Judah was the biggest tribe in the nation of Israelites. Clan by clan, the people came forward as they were called to receive their allotment for each and every family. When it was the turn for the Hezronites to come forward, now Hezron's one of the descendants that we've already covered in the genealogy of Jesus, So Salmon is actually a descendant of the Israelite clan. So he would have come forward and he would have been allotted his portion of land in the hill country of Judah. So Salmon was allotted his land in a little village called Bethlehem. And so we call that Bethlehem today, but in those days, or in Hebrew, it's called Bethlehem. And Bet means house, Lechem means bread. So Bethlehem means the house of bread. And so this is the future place, of course, that Jesus will be born. And as we know, one of the terms for Jesus, he's known as the bread of life. And so we find this connection happening right back at the time of Salmon. So God's allotment of land to Salmon, the forefather of Jesus, happens at this point in time in the Bible. And we find out that Salmon, who's basically named in the genealogy of Jesus, but doesn't have an individual story, he's obviously living throughout all of these times. And so we know that the land was actually allocated to him as a person. Now, this particular place, Bethlehem, is a place filled with fertile fields where he and his descendants could grow their crops and graze their flocks and herds. It was a place where he and his offspring would prosper and receive the blessing promised by God. So I'm going to put up the next couple of pictures of Bethlehem. So I'm just going to find that one for you. So I'm just sharing this to the screen for those on Zoom. Hopefully this is going to work again. Yes, it is. Yes, and we're going to just hold those up for Facebook viewers as well. So just come back a little bit further this way. And so what we've got two pictures of here, this shows hill country. Now the reason we put these pictures up, we went to Bethlehem, and it's an Arab settlement today, and it's very congested. It's very hard to actually see what the country even looks like. When we left Bethlehem, we had a lot of problem getting out through the concrete wall, and so we ended up being directed a different way out. And to our pleasant surprise, we ended up driving through these rolling hills on the way back up to Jerusalem. The pleasure of these pictures that I've just shown you, and again they'll be posted onto the YouTube video, is that you can actually see what the hills look like. So the Bible tells you constantly, it mentions hill country, hill country, hill country. So for me, I don't know about you, I'm quite interested to know, I wonder what that hill country actually looks like. And so the top picture that you were shown, you can actually see with the road meandering through, but you can see all of the hills, and you can see they're not mountains, but they are hills, and they're very winding, and there's valleys passing through them. The picture that was at the bottom is actually a close-up picture when we were sitting on the road waiting to go through the checkpoint, and you can see all of the rocks there. Those rocks are all limestone. So in the fields there, they had all of this limestone everywhere. So you can imagine when they actually had to plant their crops and when they had to till their fields, they actually had to go into areas, and they would have had to move all of these boulders in order to use the land. Now the land's always divided up into two areas. One area is used for farming itself, and the other area is used for grazing. So you can imagine that these areas which were rougher and steeper would have been left with the exposed rock, because it still provides all of the grasses between them for the animals to graze on. So this picture at the bottom would have been grazing land. On the flat areas, on the tops of the hills, the ground would have been more suitable, and so they would have used that for farming. So these pictures just give you a little insight today of what it would have looked like back in the day without all the buildings and all the noise that we see in the land today. So hopefully that helps you have an understanding. Yeah, it's driving along here. We're on the western side of Bethlehem, having left, and we're just driving around this this circular way that brings us through this hill country. So this just sort of gives a sense of what it feels like and how high and rocky it is. So when we were travelling these ancient days, they were literally, the
way to Shur was across the ridge, across the top, so they didn't come up and down all these hills. But this is what it would have been like to come down from Bethlehem towards the Philistines through the Shephelah Valley.
So Jesus says, so we're just going to connect to this, the house of bread that I actually mentioned, when Jesus calls himself the bread of life, that comes from John, the book of John in the New Testament, chapter 6, and it's mentioned in verse 35 and verse 48. So this connection between Bethlehem, or Bethlehem as it was originally mentioned, meaning house of bread, it was a designated place by the Lord when they placed Salmon there as the future forefather of Jesus himself. And when Jesus came, as I said, he mentioned that he himself was called the bread of life. So Bethlehem was going to be this future place of birth. So when we look at it, it doesn't look very much, but we know that Jesus came from humble beginnings, and so it is when we see it today. In John chapter 6 verse 47 to 51, it reads, "I tell you the truth, he who believes has everlasting life. I am the bread of life. Your forefathers ate the manna in the desert, yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which a man may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I give for the life of the world." So you can see from Jesus' words that there is a great significance to this word bread when he's speaking about who he is himself. And there's that comparison with the forefathers who had the manna in the desert, which was actually the bread of life that was provided to the Israelites before they came to the land of Canaan by the Lord himself. So this name, this town, this location is part of the prophecy that the Messiah, Jesus Christ, will not just be born there, but that he is the one who can promise power over death, that is everlasting life, as that scripture tells us, that I am the living bread that comes down from heaven. So although Bethlehem is allotted to the tribe of Judah, it's not mentioned by name in the book of Joshua. So if you actually go researching in your Bible, they don't list every single village and every single town, but nor are many others. You see, Bethlehem in reality was only a little tiny village in these ancient times, and the lists that are provided mention only the larger towns or cities by name. At the end of each list of specifically named towns given for the hill country, it says, "and their villages." So in other words, it doesn't name them by name, but it actually mentions that there's many more smaller towns, if you will, or villages that are listed. So in Joshua chapter 15, it's mentioned in verses 51, 54, 57, 59 and 60. So there's numerous mentions where it finishes off "and their villages," meaning they don't give the names of every single location. And so it is that Bethlehem is not actually mentioned by name at this point in time. We can, however, glean that Salmon was allotted land here for his future descendants are both named and described as living in Bethlehem. And so his son, the future son, is Boaz. So Boaz obviously is well known in the Bible, in the book of Ruth. He is the kinsman redeemer who's going to take care of them. And in Ruth chapter 4 verse 11 it reads, "May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem." His grandson Obed is also mentioned in Ruth chapter 4 verses 13 to 17, and his great-grandson Jesse in 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 1, where it says, "I am sending you, Jesse of Bethlehem." David, who was anointed to be king by the prophet Samuel in Bethlehem, is the son of Jesse. That's found in 1 Samuel 16 verse 4 to 13. And then much later the prophet Micah, who lived during the reign of the future Judean kings Jotham, Ahaz and Hezekiah, connected Salmon's family lineage not just by location to Bethlehem, but genealogically by being the very forefathers from whom the Messiah, Jesus Christ, would be born. The scripture in Micah comes from chapter 5 verse 2, and it says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." So we can ascertain from all these examples that I've given you that all of the next generations after Salmon, they mention every single one of them in Bethlehem, all the way through from Boaz through to King David. And so we know that there's this rich history of these people in Bethlehem, and so Salmon is not mentioned by name outside the genealogy, so obviously he's the person who came into the country, and so he's the one who actually received the inheritance for the first time. Now his son being Boaz, you might remember when you read the story of Ruth that Boaz was not a poor man. It tells a story that he's quite a wealthy farmer. And so it tells us that the land that was given to Salmon, the forefather of Jesus, would have been very, very good land. Because for grazing and for crops, they would have, to earn that wealth in one generation, for Boaz to be spoken of as a person who was wealthy, means that Salmon, when he arrived there, must have done a lot of work and or taken over the land for whoever the previous inhabitants were, who had actually already tilled the soil. And so we get a bit of a picture, a bit of an insight into what it would have been like back in this time. After the tribe of Judah received their allotments, the tribal descendants from Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh were given their allotments. In Joshua 18 verses 1 to 2, it says, "The whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The country was brought under their control, but there were still 7 tribes who had not yet received their inheritance." So we're finding here that they're going to all receive their inheritance, but some of them still haven't received it at this point in time. So I'm just going to check for the final picture for tonight's lesson. I'm just sharing that on Zoom. Can you guys see that? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Yep, good. Yes. So we're just going to hold that up for people viewing with us on Facebook. It's a complicated diagram, but you'll see on there by all the different colours that this is actually a map that plots all of the inherited land that was given to the different tribes of Israel. And the tribe of Judah, which you can see at the bottom in green, it actually contains the tribe of Simeon in the middle, and you can see it's by far the largest land, and it also contains the land which has got the Philistines in it at the moment. And so we see Salmon up there below Jerusalem, where Bethlehem is, in receiving his land, and Hebron, pointed out a bit earlier, for Caleb, who was the leader of the tribe of Judah, his land is there. So in this map you can also see the place called Shiloh, so you can picture where the top of the Dead Sea is. You can see Jericho and Gilgal, where the Israelites were been camping, and from there they move up through Bethel to this place called Shiloh. So we find suddenly that the encampment of the Israelites is now going to move. So I'll just pop that back onto the normal screen. So it's a fascinating map. It's something, again, I'll post that onto the YouTube video so you can have a closer look at that. It's the subject of a huge amount of work and study from myself, but the idea is to put all of that on there so you can actually get a real picture of what it actually looked like when the land was divided up. And specifically we're pointing out where Salmon actually received his inheritance, and obviously the leader at the time of the tribe of Judah, Caleb, who received Hebron below him. Significant also is Simeon, the tribe of Simeon inside, and we're just going to speak into that before we finish up tonight. So Joshua had 3 men from each of the remaining tribes go out and survey the rest of the territory. So here's the description coming now of how it happened. He asked them to write a description from which he divided the rest of the land into 7 parts, and then lots were cast in the presence of the Lord, whereby they distributed the land according to the tribal divisions. And that's in the, you can read about all of that in Joshua chapter 18 verses 3 through to 10. And next after that came the towns for the Levites. Now notice there it actually said, and then lots were cast in the presence of the Lord. So you know what happens when we cast a lot? It basically means that people are going to choose. They're going to pick, it's like picking a straw. If I held straws in my hand, right, you pick that one, you pick that one. So you don't actually know exactly which one you're going to get. But it says here, in the presence of the Lord. So the Lord would have directed the heart of the person going to draw the lot, and that's how they would have come to know which one was which. So they did the survey, they had the lots that represented each of the surveyed areas, and then each of the leaders came along and they picked their particular straw or their lot, and it says that the Lord convicted their hearts, so they actually picked the one that the Lord had picked for them. And so that's how it actually happened. That's the physical nature of how it actually worked. So next came the towns for the Levites. The Levites were set aside to serve the Lord, so they did not receive any allotments of land, but rather towns to live in with surrounding pastures to their flocks and herds. The closest town to Salmon that was given to the Levites was Kiryat Arba, which is in fact Hebron. So this is the place where Caleb was given his allotment. And again, it's in the hill country. They were also in Joshua chapter 21, verses 9 to 16, it gives you a list, and it says that Libnah, Jatur, Eshtemoa, Holon, Debir, Ain, Jata, and Beth Shemesh were the other 8 towns with surrounding pasture lands given to the Levites from the allotted lands given to the tribes of Judah and Simeon. So we find there's 9 locations given to the Levites. They're in towns, they don't get to own the land, but they're given the land so that they can take care of themselves. Because they're Levites, they're there to serve the Lord, and as a result of that, they don't actually receive an allotment of land for themselves. However, they are given land to live on, but they never get to actually own it. So it's not something that they can actually pass on to another generation, that they can earn any money from. It's there purely to fulfill their needs, to serve the Lord himself. And so they're set apart from all the other people in all the other tribes. So because Hebron was given to both Caleb the son of Jephunneh and the Kohathite descendants of Aaron the Levites, the city and surrounding pasture land was given to the Levites, while the fields and villages around the city was given to Caleb as his possession. So obviously they had a mechanism by which they split the land up. So the Levites received the field and villages outside the city, and Caleb would receive the prime land, obviously inside the city and the closer territory. Excuse me. So we're just about finished. The Lord also, the Bible tells us, had Joshua excuse me, my throat's going dry. The Lord also had Joshua designate Hebron as one of the cities of refuge for anyone who accidentally and unintentionally killed another. So that's from Joshua 21 verse 13. So, excuse me. So we get to this point now where they've entered the land. The allotments have actually been given out. The Levites have received theirs. And so we come to the close of the life now of Joshua himself. So Joshua summons the Reubenites, the Gadites, excuse me, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and he said to them in Joshua 22, verses 2 to 4, "You have done all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded, and you have obeyed me in everything I commanded. For a long time now, to this very day, you have not deserted your brothers, but have carried out the mission the Lord your God gave you. Now that the Lord your God has given your brothers rest, excuse me, as he promised, return to your homes in the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan." So that's in Joshua 22 again, verse 2 to 4. Joshua blessed them and sent them from Shiloh to their new homes and said, "Return to your homes with your great wealth," in verse 8, "with large herds of livestock, with silver and gold, bronze and iron, and a great quantity of clothing, and divide with your brothers." Excuse me, my voice has gone. "The plunder from your enemies." So those who had joined them from the other side, who were talking about not going to battle, they had fought well, They had obeyed, and now they were being released to go back onto the other side of the Jordan River, back to their people and back to their tribes. So 7 years of successful campaigning against the Lord's enemies had made the Israelites very wealthy, and they had acquired much, for they did not work for nor produce. After the men from these tribes returned home to their families on the eastern side of the Jordan River, a long time passed, the Bible tells us. The remaining 9.5 tribes stayed in Shiloh and rested, the Bible tells us, from all their enemies around them in Joshua 23:1. So that means that they're not fighting. It says, until Joshua was 110 years old. Understanding that both Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, were the only two surviving Israelites that had come out of Egypt, gone into the land of Canaan from Kadesh Barnea, and then conquered the land of Canaan together, we know they were both from an earlier generation than any of the other Israelites. Joshua was now 110 years old, and Caleb was 85 years old. Joshua summoned the elders, the leaders, the judges, and the officials of Israel, and he said to them in Joshua 23 verses 2 to 3, I am old and well advanced in years. You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. He told them to obey the book of the law of Moses, not to associate with the nations that remained in the land of Canaan, and he warned them in verse 16 of Joshua 23, if you violate the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you will quickly perish from the good land he has given you. So he's giving them a warning. Joshua then summoned all the people of Israel to assemble at Shechem. Now, at this point in time, I'm going to finish with the lesson and pick this up next week. We find at this point in time Joshua is speaking his last words, and he's about to be gathered to his people, and Caleb's going to go soon after him. So we'll pick up with that at the beginning of next week. So I thank you for joining us. I'm just going to say good night to those who have joined us on Facebook. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's teaching. God bless you. We look forward to your company next week.